Signore e signori, buonasera, benvenuti alla casa italiana zerilli-marimò. Tonight it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome here to the casa a dear colleague and friend that I respect immensely to present his latest book. Anthony Tamburi is the Dean of the Calandra Italian-American Institute at Queen's College. And in this capacity, I believe many of you have known him and how he transformed and turned around the Institute in these years of direction. Anthony begins as an Italianista. He was trained at Berkeley, and his main interest was Italian literature of the 20th century, on which he published extensively. And then during his career, he got closer and closer to Italian-American issues. But I think he brings with himself all the baggage that comes from that philological training that he received at Berkeley. And I have to say that he really is the ideal bridge between Italian culture and Italian-American culture. There is nothing but a part of it that changed and transformed and continues to transform. As director of the Calandra, other than doing all the fantastic public programs that they do, and in this, we are partners, we believe that the university is not only for the students and for the professors, but that universities should open their doors and be some sort of a lighthouse for the community at large. So this is the belief that we have in common, and the idea that academia should open doors and windows so the ideas come and go and are transformed in this dialogue. But for example, he established a summer school with the University of Calabria, and he organizes a variety of different conferences. The last one was last January, and it was about the topic of multiculturalism, an idea of multiplicity within Italian studies. It's a much needed discussion that we need to have. If you want to see the definitive sunset of Italian studies, we need to face diversity, differences. And I would say that is also the line that keeps together the latest research of the Tamburi and this book in particular. I'm not going to talk about the book because there is here a great other colleague with me that will introduce it and lead the discussion with Peter. But this idea of Italian writers who write outside of the peninsula. So what makes Italian literature Italian? Is it the fact that you write it in Italy? Is it the fact that you write it in Italian? Is it the fact that you're Italian and write it in another language? These are just issues that go way beyond the issue of Italian-American literature, but that Anthony explores in such a way that I think his methodology will be usefully adopted also in other circumstances and in other cultural situations. So I'm delighted to have a chance to have him here with us to talk about these fundamental topics. And as I told you, we have to talk about his book with him, Professor Carravetta, who is currently a professor of philosophy at Stony Brook University. He previously held the first Alphonse D'Amato Endowed Chair in Italian Studies. And again, from these two chairs, from Italian Studies to philosophy, there is a sort of the parable of Peter, who is a philosopher and a scholar of philosophy, and that's how it starts, but also a poet in his own right, and a critic of poetry. And throughout his career, there is nothing contradictory. There is this trajectory that goes through from poetry to philosophy, from philosophy to poetry, and the theory of both of them. And he's the perfect person, and you will see why, to present this book with the Tamburi. And Professor Carravetta, I just want to mention that he's the founding editor of Differenzia, a review of Italian thought. And whereas Dean Tamburi, among many other things, and the books that he writes, he's also the editor in charge of Bordighera Press, that is a press that should be recognized for the work that it does to bring to the American market very, very important titles, both of Italian literature, Italian-American literature, and much more. So we have two fantastic guests, and I have nothing left to do but inviting you to please welcome them with a very warm applause. Thank you. parli tutto qua.
Okay, thank you, Stefano. It's always a pleasure to be here. NYU is my alma mater. That's where I got my PhD. Before there was the Casa Italiana, there used to be a department of French and Italian at NYU, and that's where I studied in late 70s up to the early 80s. Anyway, it is thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce my friend's latest book, Un biculturalismo negato. This book, since Anthony and I go back 40 years, and we've been sort of fighting wars on both sides of the ocean on this. So it brings me to readdress, for the nth time, the annosa questione, as they say in Italian, which often I will alter to say the penosa questione of recognition and acceptance of a number of writers within a canon. Writers who the definition would be writers who write in a language but live normally in a country where that language is not spoken, save in very circumscribed spaces or situation. It's a question we, meaning Anthony, myself, and I think I recognize a few people in the audience, have been struggling with for, as I said, many decades. Too long at this point to go over the social literary history of the precedents to this book. It's all out there for those who care to lean outside their windowsills and check out what the campesinos, those weirdos, are doing out there at the margin, in the sottobosco, in the penumbras of Main Street, USA, or alternatively, la strada maestra dei maggiori, and trailing behind in the caboose, I minori. Questions that ultimately rock and shake the canon. And I made a big deal of this because I dealt with this even from Middlebury years and years ago, and I actually wrote an entry on that in the Routledge Companion to World Literatures, what are canons? The one protected with cannons lodged on the battlements of the aristocratic castles in pre- and early modern times, and then under the sway of the bourgeoisie when he finally got au pouvoir. What's the issue or issues at stake? Going through a checklist, each one requiring hours and days and semesters to tease out critically, properly, we have power as actual control or what is deemed worthy to be included in the club and what is not. This translates into gaining access to the means of production and reproduction of the literary artifact. Forgive me if the language sounds a little bit like 80s, but it's fine. It's apropos. It's what exactly happens. Okay, so the second key word is legitimacy, which everyone claims and seeks to obtain with the recurring paradigm of those inside, those who made it, holding to their identity and refusing or denying those on the outside. Here's the word negato will come up. It is what allows a writer, and by extension I mean the producers in the various arts, to identify him or herself as belonging to this or that guild. The third major semantic, symbolic, critical area is psychological and political reassurance that one is in the majority, characterized again by the proclivity to protect that placement or collocazione in Italian at all costs. Thus, even when the ammunition is no longer available, as for instance, after a revolution, an invasion, an earthquake, and I mean that's symbolically, an earthquake, or the emergence of a new guru who dictates what poetry is and what is not poetry, they resort to daggers and ice picks to keep those disturbing others, hybrids, minorities, parolees, evacuees, jailbirds, prostitutes, orphans, infidels, traitors, polymaths, experts in other fields, nomads, and paradigm of them all, migrants, out. The notion that in this century, where all borders, this century, and I'm talking about the 21st century, where all borders a porous, against the shrill media politicking about walls of all sorts going up along rivers and ports and mountain passes, something that should make social historians cringe. Haven't we learned anything from the past? We still have to address this issue, and it is almost disheartening at this late date. In over 30 years, Tamburi, born into Italianistica, as Stefano mentioned before, Italianistica USA, itself a category viewed with suspicion by the Italianisti doc from the Madrepatria, has slowly migrated, well, let's not abuse the symbolic power of each of these lexemes, has slowly expanded its interests to include literature by Italians and literature about Italy in the United States. I am, of course, avoiding the taboo word Italian-American. So from now on, I'm going to call it the IA word, the IA literature, with the foreseeable consequence that after a while, not too many Italianisti paid attention to him to some degree. I mean, he wrote beautiful books on the avant-gardes, on Palazzeschi, and so on. But once he started turning to Italian-American literature, this I know, there was no need to document, you just know your profession, you know your colleagues. He was like, ma tu come Tamburi ti dedichi a questa letteratura americana, what are you doing? You know, I mean, I felt this, I heard this, you know, being said, you know, 30 years ago, 20 years ago. So with the foreseeable consequence that some people just were expressing doubts about this approach, this shift. This actually it should have been looked from the beginning as an opening up already. From the beginning, it should have been an opening up. It took us, but after basically relaunching the discipline of IA studies in the 90s, and this, to be philologically correct, with the collaboration of a few stalwart believers in this minority literature, such as Fred Gardefè and Bobby Scusi and others, well, Scusi differently, independently, and being sensitive to what was being explored and examined in contiguous fields, such as the various hyphenated literatures, but as well as disciplines, such as sociology, cultural anthropology, political discourse within and outside academia, and the like. And then, producing, besides his own individually authored several books, tens of anthologies and journals, thus shutting up all those lazy windowsill watchers who in previous generations had chimed, "What are the Italian-American writers?" This by someone that at one point I wrote a traitor, but then I erased the word. Okay. I mean, that's why I feel a kind of a complicity with Anthony, because that's what we did. We went out and read a lot of cultural anthropology and history, you know, to make it all give like anchor the literature between the two big canons. Thus, okay. And by the by, as the discourse is, from the very beginning we understood this, transnational, he could not, in due time, re-enter the arena of the Italianisti doc, figuring out how he can pitch his broader field of options, critical models, and writers practically ignored back home, and so on. And as he quickly notes, and when he does go back to Italy as an Italianista, and I was part of some of this. I was invited to some of his meetings, some of the conferences he organized, where he took an active part. The seminar, the Rockefeller Foundation seminar, etc., where we actually came into contact with Italianisti, but also Anglisti, Americanisti. They were actually the first ones to actually start saying, when we study American literature, forget outside of the canon, not forget the canon, outside of the canon of American literature. Well, I mean, there's other literature by minority groups. So when they met us, they says, oh, there is an Italian-American literature. So we finally, we had some success there. We brought a lot of people who came here, studied these writers, and then they slowly said, my God, there's a whole world out there. But what Anthony notes, which is basically at the heart of this book, I think, is that it notes a similar terrain, different streets, as Fred said, yes, a different national idiom, of course, But when it comes to the dynamic of inclusion-exclusion, of power and validation and appropriation, they were analogous signs, indeed often parallel ones, almost isomorphic, to put it in semiotic terms. So after mainstreaming, to some degree, IA literature, Anthony and company, and I modestly put myself in that company, has been trying for several years now, not only to bring a greater awareness and therefore hope of increased critical inclusion within the high walls of the canon, but he has also attempted, and this book is the latest evidence of this commitment, to engage Italianisti in the Madrepatria to consider that the minoritarian literature produced by these vagrants, fugitives, survivors who arrive on Italian shores not on luxury liners, but mostly by swimming for their lives, and then replant roots, grow in the Italian milieu, adapt and adopt the fruits of that quagmire, that selva, that multiverse, which is Italian culture, however defined, that mare magnum of Italian culture. And the problem he encounters? Lo sappiamo. Academia and the spokespersons for a vague sense of what is it really Italian literature have been resistant, unkind, often insulting. What makes this book interesting and important, therefore, is that leveraging years of study on the origin and development of Italian American, IA literature, which volens nolens has its origins in the great exodus of 1880-1913, Anthony is now telling our compatriots that, hey, the literature of the immigrants written in Italian and residing in Italy deserves, and I lost a page, oh, here it is, deserves attention, should not be negata, coming to the other key word. In fact, going back to as Italian American literature was for decades, until the 90s, basically. It's unbelievable if you think about it. When I used to teach Italian American culture and literature, it was a course in American social history. Inevitably, it turned out into that. Okay? So, cultura negata and biculturale, that's the other problem. Can someone, like we were saying before, can someone be a master of several languages? Can someone write literature in more than one language? That's been my personal problem. And we know the answer. The majority of people would say, you can only write in your native tongue. Now, there's the famous writer Ngugi from Kenya who says, I'm not going to write in English because that's the language of the empire that conquered Kenya. So he went back to writing in his native dialect. And it's a language of a very restricted population. If I were to write in my native dialect, the kids in my native town don't understand it at this point. So I will be writing for about 20 people a little bit older than me, still alive,
That's what the town is.
Huh?
Which town?
The town is called Lappano, population 650, in the summer about 800, and it's about 12 kilometers from Cosenza on the hills, on the outskirts of the plateau of La Sila. So my first language, my second language is Italian. My third language is English, and my fourth language went back to being Italian again. I had to relearn it, when I was here. Okay, so indeed, I think Anthony is going soft on his colleagues and readers in general. There are no two worlds, as my former professor here at NYU stated 25 years, Paolo Valesio, one Italian world and one American world, and he said, well, lo scrittore tra due mondi. Okay, it was a good opening salvo, I think. But as I had the opportunity to state in one of my own writings, that is almost too simple, almost simplistic. There are several worlds interlocking and influencing one another constantly. For the world defined solely in terms of the national language used flattens the variety of uses, registers, the multiple microcosms or social classes or inter and translinguistic realities we live in each day, both here and there. The contribution of cultural studies, which I couldn't believe it. I mean, you just reminded me of this big resistance, I remember the first translation of Homi Baba. People say, ma voi americani, chi è questo Homi Baba? That's okay. But then, it caught on in some circles. The contribution of cultural studies, and I couldn't agree more with him, on the fact that even cultural studies has met with great resistance, as I just said, okay, revolves above all on the awareness that cultures are fluid, multifaceted, transformative, and yes, vis-a-vis an exclusivist, rigid, indeed racist notion of the canon, they are a troubling sector of critique, one that challenges all the panaceas of literature for in and by itself. You quote I.A. Richards. I guess the original was written in English, but about
Richards or Turner?
No, Richards. You quote I.A. Richards as literature. When you analyze literature, everything is in the text, and you can only talk about what is properly literature. Right. Well, in the Italian version, you could have just said Benedetto Croce. Questa è poesia, e questa è non poesia. And it destroyed, the damage it did to Italianistic is incredible for more than half a century. Okay? Meno male che poi Contini and others start opening up the criticism. Okay? So, why is it so hard to accept not only the biculturalismo, but the multicultural makeup of each of us who spend time consuming and analyzing and discussing cultural artifacts, no matter who made them, no matter in which country or territory or island or mental trip they were produced in. In the introduction, Anthony takes to task those in Italy who resist the acceptance of a literature not written in Italian because it doesn't refer to Italian things, thus eliminating IA literature in one fell swoop, whereas, as he suggests, what matters is the ur sign, relying on the semiotics of Peirce, but other people have talked about that. Even in Patterson, you find his reaction to talk about philosophy, his reaction to like the ur culture. What is the primeval thing from which everything comes, and language comes. It's on top of that as a system of conventions. So. Italian-American writers, for better or for worse, somehow were writing about Italy. It's just in a different language at this point, okay? So why eliminate the content of the literature all of a sudden because of the language? They both, these distinctions, this is the language and this is the content. Okay, so they are writing about Italy in all its long, complicated historicity, or conversely, literature written in Italian whose content, and you quote a few of them, mind you, content, reference, symbolic words are not Italian. What does that mean? You write in Italian, and because you write about Senegal, how your father treated you back when you were a kid before you immigrated to Italy, well, il contenuto non è italiano. What does that mean? So anyway. So I actually said that this is like reductive, provincial, and a fascist idea of culture. I have written about canons elsewhere, as I told you. They are historical formations that become dominant starting in the 17th century, grew with various Muratori and others just before the Romantic period. They became normative and hegemonic in the 19th century, which is not by chance the age of nationalism and nation building in Europe. And by now, they're almost superfluous. As literature, artists, and scientists in general, if you really look at it, have always been cosmopolitan, world-weary travelers and explorers whose encounters with boundaries have provided material for examinations and visions of how humans cope and compete, adjust and rewrite the maps constantly. I'm finished. There are other topics for discussion here. The notion of italicità, a word banned, or italici, a word banned for over half a century, owing to its association with fascism. But now, I ask, do we have to pay for centuries for our grandparents' mistakes? Indeed, there are Italianisti who are superior to their homegrown ones, who were born in a different nation state and speak 2 or 3 other languages. Should they not also be allowed into the citadel? Perhaps they have something to tell us. Perhaps they see things differently. Perhaps we should not lock them out. And here I'm reminded, for instance, that some of the greatest Dante scholars are not Italians. Or when I was younger, I studied linguistics, the greatest histories of the Italian language and of Italian dialects were written by a Yugoslav and by a Swiss German. I was born in Calabria. I remember my dialect. I was interested in linguistics. And the greatest book about Calabrian dialect was written by Gerhard Rolfs, 3 volumes. So now, naturally, there was always 1 or 2 words that he missed. Oh, my God. But the greatest book about Italian dialects was written by a German, Swiss person, a scholar. I mean, just think. So that gave, so you know where I'm going with that. So Italici, I think, should be brought back in circulation. On this, Anthony has developed an epistemological scheme on page 126, which I think is repeated twice from page to page, by the way. There must have been a misprint by the editor, to indicate how the way Italians read and react to immigrant literature is actually, as I said before, isomorphic. The way the Italian academia, the Italian intellectuals, the Italian elite has been reacting to immigrant literature in Italy sort of reproduces, by analogy, right, the reverse of what happened to the way Americans reacted to hyphenated literature in general. Okay, let's call it that. So structurally, the whole thing is a real attack, number 1, on an idea of literature which is antiquated, to say the least, which is suspect right now, and also to an idea of what literature is. I don't think people really, sometimes when they make these discussions, just one note, which I think is relevant to the discussion, is when I was at Queen's College in European Languages and Literatures and Cultures, and for 4 years I was the chair of the department. And I went to my the professors in French, and I said, why don't we do a course on francophone literature? Qu'est-ce que c'est ça? C'est pas le français. Right away. This is like in 1995. The best literature in French is not produced in France anymore. And the same thing happened with the Spanish canon. Most great literature. I'm not saying that the national literature is not good. What I'm saying is that there should be space and an acceptance of literature written in Spanish outside of Spain, and French literature outside of France. And so we have an Italian literature, in which I've been involved, both as an editor, as a critic, and as a producer, produced outside of Italy, which has encountered a lot of resistance in being accepted. And I think this book goes a long way, because 4 of the essays are about writers in Italian who live abroad, and Anthony demonstrates what do they have that the Italian writers have? I mean, these actually, because of their perspective, they actually have a more interesting viewpoint on life, society, and so on and so forth. Grazie.
Thank you, Peter. I want to thank Stefano, because when I was fortunate last summer, not only did this book come out, but the Italian version of this book came out. I'm going to do a little bit of show and tell, go back to my high school teaching days. It's really uncanny and extremely significant that Peter Carravetta is the presenter of this, because in a way, this is a 1991 publication, but has its roots in a much smaller article entitled To Hyphenate or Not to Hyphenate. And that was a discussion that grew out of my work with Paolo Giordano and Fred Gardefei, putting together From the Margins, Writings in Italian Americana, which is this 500-page anthology that we did at the end of the 80s, partly because of resistance, not only from Italians, but actually from Italian Americans. And that's a whole sort of discourse. What I'm going to do is just bring you through a zigzag walk through part of the book, basically chapters 1 and 7. I purposely split up the chapter. It's a little bit of a risk, but I split up the chapter because I wanted people to get a certain concept with chapter 1, and then go read the various authors, the works by, or what I say about each work, one work about each of the authors, and then in the end, see how I replace them as far as that. And I'm going to show you the graph and stuff, 2 of them actually. Peter's conversation basically explained the title, the subtitle. And if I had written this book in English, it probably would have had that title, and I would have probably had to argue with the publisher about the title being too complex. But the situation is complex, as Peter has outlined. And anyway, so I want to thank Stefano and Julian. Stefano, because when I wrote to a couple of friends, saying, hey, I got these books, and maybe we can have a conversation. Within 24 hours, Stefano's answered. He was the first one to answer. And since then, Julian's been wonderful in setting this up. We had conversations about what are we going to do with negato, how are we going to explain it, how are we going to translate it. Because in Italian, it's nicely ambiguous, right? Because it could be both active, that is, denying it, or it could be sort of benign neglect, right? Negato in the sense that we just don't pay attention to it. And so the idea of invisible, we went through a number of words, the idea of invisible seems to be the best. So the one word Peter didn't mention, but he definitely danced around it, is identity. This is all about identity and who you are. And I'm going to go through a couple of things. The first thing was, Peter mentioned italianistica, and there's a difference between Italian studies, as we know it in various places, and I'm going to point out here at NYU, and italianistica as we know it within the peninsula and the two big islands. It's a philological, historical, one might say etymological, thematic, author-biographically based way of studying, which is fine. But unfortunately, they don't leave any room for anything else. Where Italian studies goes beyond the methodologies, and it goes beyond literature, and it goes in the cinema, and it goes into a little bit of history, and it goes in a little bit of sociology, it goes in a little bit of linguistics, if not a lot of linguistics. And that thing called semiotics that nobody wants to talk about because it's a Greek sounding, and that thing called hermeneutics that nobody wants to talk about because it frightens us, right? So it's identity, it's labeling, right? And that's why I sort of play here with the parentheses, the slash, the brackets. And Peter's right, Italian American is a problematic term, and that was one of the reasons why I decided to sort of play with it in a serious sense back in 1989. And I say 1989 because it was a little essay that Peter actually published. He was then one of the consulting editors of a more popular journal called the Italian Journal. And Peter got this sort of discourse, semi-discourse analysis essay published in that. And Peter also, the other reason is when he said we worked together, I was in the hinterlands of Indiana for 13 years. And so my colleague and I decided that one of the ways we could survive is if we did an annual conference on Romance languages. And so we would have about 40 Italianists come every year from across the country and a few people from Italy. And Peter was one of the people who came, and he didn't mention it, but there are a number of footnotes here that include his name referencing him and his work. One of the first things with regard to writing is that he did a number of sessions at our conference, and with a long introduction called Poesaggio, Poesia and Saggio. And it was one of the first analytical, in-depth analyses of this idea of writing in Italian outside of Italy. And so that was back in 1989, 30 years ago. So the other question is, so there was that, and Peter spoke about this. The other question is labeling, I said, right? So when we go back to the history of Italian emigration, or from our perspective, immigration, right? What do we call that? We call it just like, did my grandfather at 16 decide, I think I'm going to go to America. I think I'm going to quit school in the 5th grade and go to America. I don't think so, because that little town in Lazio where he was from was emptying out, and there wasn't much to do there. And so they had to leave, because if they didn't leave, they might not have starved, but they definitely wouldn't have had a good life. and it was survival, right? If you grew up in an Italian-American enclave in the United States and you lived with those immigrants that were born, like my grandparents, in 1878 and 1881, the one word you heard often when Italy came up was miseria, la miseria, right? So in the early 90s, some of us started to talk in terms of a diaspora, and that sparked some conversations, because that was a term that was supposed to be reserved for 3 historical exoduses and genocides, right? The Jewish diaspora, the Armenian diaspora, and of course, African slavery, and those were supposed to be. So we were saying, but no, we can expand the term. And this is where the old notion of labeling comes in. We can expand the term, and let's try to expand it and see. Let's talk about what is behind a diaspora, taking it, uncoupling it from those 3 events. Necessity, the necessity that is there that forces you to leave, right? And so we started to talk in those terms, right? That sense of involuntarily. I have 4 grandparents who left Italy in between 1899 and 1913, and actually the couple was husband 1899 going back and forth, and the wife 1913 with 6 kids that were born after each trip back to Italy, right? So that was one way of labeling that we finally, people agree. There are still a couple of our friends out there, some hardcore historians, who say that we shouldn't use the word diaspora when it comes to that Italian immigration. So I'm talking 1880 to 1924, and they use 24 because that's the Johnson-Reed Act when the doors were hermetically closed, right? So that's one. Now the other issue is, how did they see us? How do they see us? Well, they don't see us very much, as Peter pointed out, because in Italy, the idea that 30 million people left Italy in a 100-year period is not part and parcel of the Italian curriculum in the public school system. So they don't study their emigration history. It would be like us talking about the Civil War as a skirmish between 2 states, right? They don't talk about that at all. So there's whatever you want to call it, there's a sense of removal. That doesn't, right? So I sort of irritated a few people back in 2007 when I wrote about a journal that had dedicated its issue to Le Americhe che leggiamo, the Americas that we live, and it was dedicated to ethnic literature of the United States. And so these are the literatures that they discussed. And if you look at this, you see that basically what we have is the federally recognized affirmative action groups of the United States, which is fine. But there are other ethnic literatures, right? There was this guy running around named Philip Roth. There was this other guy running around named Don DeLillo, and so on and so forth. In the journal, Jews are mentioned as sort of on the margin of ethnicity because they're really part of mainstream, they say, whatever, the editors. There is not one reference to the American writer of Italian descent, in spite of the fact that one of the best writers living today, prose writers, is Don DeLillo, in spite of the fact that whatever you may think of him, and I've been critical of him, there was also the founder, one of the founders of New Journalism, who has also become a writer, a creative writer in his own right, Gay Talese, and others, and there are others, right? So this is what I found. So I questioned it, especially because this is one of the part of their introduction, in which they talk about the renaissances of the 70s and 80s. And so my question was, well, and these are Americanists. These are scholars of American literature who put this together. And it's a great journal. It's just that we're not there. We weren't invited to the table, We weren't invited to the ethnic table. We don't have to be invited to all the tables. But I think the ethnic table we might be invited to. And we weren't invited to the ethnic table. So we have this. Now, of course, in the United States, there's the multi-ethnic literatures of the United States, the Society for Multi-Ethnic Literature of the United States, which has a journal, which, of course, dedicated 2 or 3 issues to Italian-American studies, talking about, in fact, a renaissance of Italian-American studies, and so on and so forth. So, so finally, at the Bellagio meeting that Peter referenced, we invited 2 of the founders of the journal, and they came, and they were delightful. And from there, I must say that in 2017 they published an issue on Italian-American cinema, and it was great, and it's great. So through conversation, through dialogue, things happen, right? As long as we can be critical as long as we do it in a nice way. We can have polite indignation, right? So there are Italian-American writers in English. These are just some of them that have existed and still exist, right? The writers who do deal with John Chardy. Most Americans have forgotten John Chardy. John Chardy is an extremely important literary figure in the United States, extremely important. He was a powerhouse when it came to editing. He was a most productive, very productive poet, 45 to 46 books of poetry, something like that. And every once in a while, you find references to Italy.
My name is Dante.
No, you're in the other one. You're in the other one. So I know, but I couldn't, give people dual. So we have the writers in English. Now, getting back to the book, Un biculturalismo negato, la letteratura italiana negli Stati Uniti, Italian literature in the United States. Well, there are Italian-American, quote-unquote, writers in Italian. And here you have people who are alive still and who are not alive, and people who span basically from the beginning of the 20th century to today and still writing. These are writers who publish with some of the best publishing houses in Italy. Garzanti, Mondadori, Bompiani, all of them, Rizzoli, all of them. And yet, when it comes to any sort of establishment recognition from Italy, they often are not included. And just the notion of writing outside of Italy, not just in the United States, because there's a plethora of writers who write in Italian who live in at least 14 or 15 countries. Peter was part of an anthology called Poets of the Italian Diaspora, and they represent 14 or 15 countries. The majority are from the United States and I think Australia, but they represent all those. So we have this. So we have a problem. We have a problem, and I'm going to digress a little bit. We have a problem with how we are seen and how we are considered. And I'm going to show you an image that's a really offensive image. And it's an image that appeared in 1992 in a monthly called L'Indice dei Libri del Mese. Or L'Indice del Mese dei Libri, whatever it is. It's basically the Italian New York Review of Books, right? So when Peter referenced the margin, when we Paolo Giordano and Fregorefe and I published this anthology from the margins, writings of the Italian Americana, and it got some play in Italy. We were reviewed on the 3rd page of La Stampa. Back then the 3rd page was the place if you wanted to appear anywhere, and it was a nice review, whatever. Well, somebody did an article on Italian American literature, and part of it for L'Indice, and part of it was about our anthology, and we were all jazzed about it, as we would say in California, you having lived in California. We were all jazzed about it, and so when I went to Italy, I got a copy of the. This is the image in the middle of the page of a very positive article on Italian American literature. So this is 1992. I think I reference it in the book here in the introduction. I don't have the image, but I reference it. It's, for those of you who know Italian, this is the way I sort of joke about it. There's the expression prendere per il culo. And it seems that that what's happening here is that the culo is being put in a transitive in a transitive position. So it's the culo that's prendere la testolina del ragazzino. I don't know. We just had to sort of laugh about it because it was just it's so absurd, right? Instead, there are some really good things happening. Some of our colleagues, for example, there's a book that's called Italian Mobilities, which actually in the introduction speaks to about what's going on in Italy today with Italian migration, but in the introduction, rightfully so, speaks to the relationship between historical immigration to the United States and what's going on in Italy. And so these are two quotes that we find in the introduction, and I was really happy to see this. And you can see when framed in a larger historical context, the experience of Italian immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century helps to render legible. I love that, helps to render legible. I'm jealous of that phrase. I wish I had come up with it first. Helps to render legible the unsettling volte-face of the Italian state toward immigrants at the beginning of the 21st century. So that's a really important recognition there. But this was already going on in Italy. Armando Nishi was really one of the people who sort of dealt with immigration literature to Italy, one of the first to deal with immigration literature to Italy. There's a whole corpus of work on it. But I found this to be so important when he says, we Italians have to learn from our migratory past. And the idea of seeing what happened to the Italians who left Italy, where they went, what they experienced, and so on and so forth. Now we can sort of understand better what's happening with those who are coming here. I've got tons of horrible imagery that I use all the time about how Italians were represented here. So what can we learn to make it better? Just for everybody, not just for the immigrants, for us too. Make it better for us too with what's going on, right? And so Nishi, this is already 2003, but also one of our colleagues who lives here in the States instead, and these are a couple of the people that I cite, have dealt with this. It's not enough to displace our attention to Italian American literature to discover that the fact that a first generation did not have the language to express these appearance. This is Graziella Parati in one of her first books in dealing with immigrant literature in Italy. And this is from the introduction of an anthology of some of the writings. And here too, she reverts back to the necessity to understand, if we understand in greater depth the Italian American experience, we can understand also the blank hyphen Italian, the African Italian experience, African whether it's sub-Saharan or whether it's North Africa, right? So now, identity. And here's where, so we're already having a problem with this, with who is Joseph Tuziani? 24 years old, 1947, comes to the United States and ends up staying here. Came for a few months with a certain intention and ends up staying here. He's still alive at 95. He's still writing. Who writes in Italian? Who writes in English? Who writes in Gargano? And who writes in Latin? There's a small coterie of about 100 poets worldwide who write in Latin. They're published out of a journal in Finland, and they write to each other in sonnets. It's wonderful. It's great. So who is Joseph Tuziani? Is he Italian? Is he American? Who is the ones I mentioned before? The first person was Luigi Ballerini. Is he Italian? Is he Italian American? Is he Italian immigrant? Whatever. Who is the person that Peter worked with very much? And I won't include Peter because Peter came when he was 11 years old. But who is Paolo Vallesio, who came here in his late 20s and then lived here until a couple of years ago and retired and went back to Italy? Is he Italian? Is he an expat? We know, those of us who are Americans know what expat means. Expat means you can afford to move to Florence and live on the other side of the Arno up in the hills and walk to Omero's restaurant and get some pollo schiacciato or whatever it is that Omero's famous for, right? That's an expat. An expat isn't someone who leaves the country, comes here and gets a job because they need the job. As glorious as that job may be, they need a job, right? That person has moved from point A to point B. That person has migrated from point A to point B. And so we have to accept, and so the actual acceptance of the word immigration, immigrant, migrant is still problematic with people. People get angry at us when we talk about Italian 50, 60-year-olds who have been here for half their lives, and who say, the word immigration, immigrant, oh my God, no, they didn't immigrate. They didn't emigrate. They didn't immigrate, Like 2013, The then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Emma Bonino, was at the Italian consulate and said, basta con la fuga dei cervelli. We have to come up with another term. Let's call it spostamento dei talenti. Well, again, with diaspora, fuga dei cervelli, fuga, spostamento. Fuga is necessity. Spostamento is choice, right? So we have to make sure that the whole idea behind this, one of the major ideas is that we have to be clear of terminology. And with that, things are going to expand. So back in 1991, at one of our conferences, Rebecca West, who is a professor of Italian, who is of Russian origin, who since the age of 18 had been studying, eating, drinking, sleeping Italian, living in Italy, living in Chicago, where she taught until a few years ago at the University of Chicago, problematized the notion of what does it mean to be Italian, and brought it totally outside the sphere of biology, DNA, semiotics, somatic origins and things of that sort, right? And really talked about it as a social construct. That is, regardless of what my physical origin is, where my body comes from, if I am 50 some odd years old as she was back then, and since the age of 18 have been eating, drinking, sleeping Italian, I no longer read American literature, I read only Italian literature, as a lot of us have done, right? Who am I? Who am I? Am I, quote unquote, a Russian American who studies Italian? Who am I, right? And we reverse the tables for the Italians. And there's a mutual friend of ours who always says who is Italian, who came here and then went back to Italy, who always says to those who in their 60s and have been here for 40 of their 60 years, say, I'm Italian. And she sort of jokingly says, so when do you eat your salad, before or after dinner? And she'll catch them sometimes. They go, well, before, what's the difference? What's the matter, right? Well, it does matter. That little insignificant thing of eating your salad before dinner as opposed to after dinner means that you've made a shift here. You have made some sort of behavioral cognitive shift that means you're no longer Italian. I lived in Florence for a lot, and I always say, you no longer go in Via Masaccio at the Esselunga, which was the first big supermarket in Florence, to do your shopping. You go to Gristides, or you go to D'Agostino's, or you go to Food Fair, or whatever, right? That makes a difference. It makes a difference. The fact that you get a bag automatically here, and you don't still to get a bag automatically there, right? All of that makes a difference. It makes a difference, right? All right. So where does this lead us? What do I want to say? I want to say Peter talked about the Ursign. So this is sort of one of the two ways that, and pardon my play on words with derivative, right? But I had to find something for derivative, so derivative, right? So really, Italy is in the center. Italy as concept, Italy as place, is in the center, right? But we have writers of the Italian diaspora in a local language, so our American, United States people who write in English, right? But we also have writers of the Italian diaspora who write in Italian. All those people I put up there before. One of the names I put up is a faculty member. We can argue about her identity, a faculty member here, because she might be around 40-something. She might only be here about 10, 12 years. And we can talk about where's the cutoff point, right? Where's the cutoff point? Where's the cutoff point for when you become the quote-unquote migrant, immigrant, etc.? And that's a good conversation to have. It's good to have, right? And then underneath, I just put it in parentheses because I'm not ready to deal with them yet. I sort of may be, but not right yet. And I wasn't for this book. It's this, the non-Italian diaspora writer. The Italici, as Peter referenced, which is a notion brought up by an entrepreneur named Piero Bassetti, who then later in life. So, and I mentioned Rebecca West and of course Jhumpa Lahiri. Those of you who know American literature know Jhumpa Lahiri, award-winning writer, whatever, a friend of the Casa Italiana, right, who has now written actually 3 books. She has a little book on book covers. But she wrote the first book in Altre Parole, and now she has a novel, Dove mi trovo. And just the title itself, Dove mi trovo, where I find myself, right? The idea of identity. So we have those writers as well. We don't have the same amount of non-Italian born writers writing in Italian as perhaps maybe the French or as English Americans or English may have, but we have some. We have some. So there's this. So there is this one relationship between this thing called Italy and all of these different types of writers, right? Now, this grows out of this, because this is a circle that I'm coming around in a way, because I wanted to make the Italian writers here, the Rita Dinale, who's one of the chapters, Alfredo De Palchi, Joseph Tusiani, when they were writing in Italian, I wanted to make them Italian-American. I made that argument, and I think it stands. But now I want to do something different, because as ethnicity is fluid, so are our thoughts are fluid and our ideas, right? So now I want to do something different, also because I found more resistance in Italy. And find more resistance, it's fun to fight the resistance, right? So I wanted to do something different and say, you know what? I'm going to revert back now to my childhood, which I grew up in an Italian enclave in Connecticut. And we were Italian. We were an Italian-American. That was a word. Italian-American was an expression that was never used in my neighborhood. We never called ourselves Italian-American. We were Italian. It wasn't until I was a freshman in college that I heard the word Italian-American for the first time in my sociology class. Otherwise, I was Italian, right? So I'm going to make now everybody Italian. Now we're going to be all Italian, right? So there's this. And then there's this. Now, so here's the movement. This is the movement. This is the physical movement. But the conceptual motion involved is this. That is, for these writers here, there's a going back, so to speak, metaphorical. That's why it's in brackets. There's a going back, so to speak. We only have one movement for these writers. They're coming to Italy. That's the Papcumas, the Amaralacuses, the Jabashegos, and so on and so forth, right? They're coming to Italy, all right. But these people are here, but in some way, shape, or form, Italy is being referenced. However, directly or indirectly, Italy is being referenced. And we need to recognize that. And the more we recognize it, the more we can talk in terms of a greater tradition, forget the word canon, a greater tradition, a greater practice of what we can call Italian literature. That Italian literature can exist in Italian. That's my main purpose with this book, that we need to talk about Italian literature in lingua, in Italian, which is what Nishi's whole thing is. His whole argument is that, forget about calling them immigrants, they're writers in Italian, and they're doing literature in Italian, and that's what he calls it. And he said, we're going to call everybody in Italian, you know. And so that's what we have here. There's one thing left out. It's in a footnote in the book that I say, this is not the place to do. There's one thing left out that we haven't, and somehow we need to make space for it, and that is literature written in dialect. And that's the other aspect. So all that to say that when we go back, when we go back to the beginning, and that is, when we go back to the beginning, and that is to this, it's a complicated issue, and we need to take into consideration Italian. We need to take into consideration the slash, which brings the Italian and the American together. And the hyphen exists only to separate. It doesn't join, it separates. And hopefully it will separate in the sense of breaking up the borders that are much too limiting, because we lose out on all of what's going on in other parts of the world in Italian. And I'll bring up, historically speaking, Pier Maria Pasinetti, who is someone who for many years lived in California. He was a professor of Italian. He wrote a novel in Italian, published it in Italy with a really good press, and then all of a sudden 2 years later it came out in English with Random House, and he published it with a really good press here. And there are others. Franco Ferrucci, for example, who left us unfortunately too early, who died early. Franco Ferrucci, in 1986, he wrote a novel. Lived in New Jersey. He lived in New Jersey, or New York. He wrote a novel called Il Mondo Creato, l'autobiografia di Dio. Wonderful. The autobiography of God. It was great. And it was a really nice, good tour de force in Italian, right? Some of these books get play in Italy, some of them don't. We have to make sure that they all get play. And one more thing, for those who wonder when it all started back at the turn of the 20th century. This is a catalog of a collector's book show that he did at the Grolier Club of Italian language books written and often published in the United States from basically the 1880s on. And it's a catalog which has a good 100 to 200 words on each of these publications. It's a wonderful history of the beginning of Italian writing in the United States. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Testing.
I start. And it's a question for both of you, because I feel that you're the author of the book, but your interlocutor has been an interlocutor for a long time. And so my question is, very few people that are not Italianisti know that most Italian writers in the canon were writing in a language that was not their maternal language. Manzoni spoke better French than Italian.
Right.
Second probably was Milanese dialect, and then Italian. Svevo, same thing. He probably was more fluent in German than he was in Italian. If you think that Goldoni, going back to the 17th century, he was Venetian. His first language was the Venetian dialect. He wrote beautiful theater in Italian. But when it came to writing his own memoir, he writes it in French.
Right.
So the fact that Italian has this quality of having been, throughout the centuries, except for a very limited minority of people living in a certain part of Tuscany, not the native language, but an acquired language, a purely literary language. What is that impact? That I'm thinking of the new writers that write in Italian as a choice, like Giunpa Lairi, as you mentioned, and Amara Lacus, both in your presentation. And for both of them, it was not a necessity, it was a choice. Because Amara is Algerian, speaking Berber and Arabic and French, but he doesn't want to write in French. No. Again, because I think there is...
He wrote one thing, he said he wrote one, I forget, he wrote one thing in Arabic, maybe?
Yes.
Right?
We had a conversation here exactly on these topics. And Italian becomes the language that he wants to use for his writing, that he adopts deliberately. And same thing for Giunpa. Bengali origins, comes here, so Bengalese is the language of the family and of affection. English is the language of culture and of her education. And then all of a sudden, she wants to become not fluent in Italian. She wants to become an Italian writer. And she does.
Yeah.
And again, do you think that for people like them, the fact that they're writing in a language that for centuries was acquired by the authors in different ways, but as they acquired it, not with their mother tongue?
It's the greatest paradox. I mean, that's the paradox of it all. It's similar to the fact that 30 million people left Italy. Italy has this very complicated emigration history and they don't study it. This is, you're pointing out, this is the other paradox, right? They don't recognize their own history. They're not recognizing their own history. And I'll tell you, and so I'm going to, irritate, to put it nicely, some of our colleagues, but some of the greatest resistance over the years to Italian American studies, and especially to Italian writing in Italian American studies, has come from Italian programs. Because of course, there too it's uncanny, because some of these programs think they're being really progressive because they do cinema and they do maybe other visual stuff, whatever. And I'm not talking about NYU, because NYU is progressive. And I've always said that publicly, and you have the only Italian American Studies chair.
Within an Italian department.
Right.
Thanks to the Tiro Senior
Right.
Foundation. So it's,
Right.
and it was a choice.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. But not because we're at NYU, but Mariucci zerilli-marimò is the person who is a wonderful model for philanthropy, by the very fact that she used her desire for philanthropy to make a difference. Because until she came along, it was the Department of French and Italian, wasn't it? Yeah. And because we know the history of Italian studies is a very difficult history in the United States, right? Because we see at some of the elite schools, there are only 2 professors in Italian. Gee, how come? And yet some state schools have 6 and 7 professors in Italian with PhD programs. So it's I don't know, it's part, for me, it's just a paradox that Italian, the intellectual brokers under that umbrella called Italian studies do not want to face. That's the way I see it. I'm trying to be diplomatic. You can be less diplomatic. You left Italian studies.
No, I'm going to take a different path here. One is that there is, like with a lot of other arts, there are a lot of pre-established reductive, let's call them stereotypical ideas about what is literature, what is cinema, and what is music, and so on. Let's talk about something momentarily to give you an example that I don't know anything about, which is music. Okay, it's 25 years that hip hop is around, and a lot of people still reject, especially people who are, what's that? That's name? Excuse me. So, no, I wanted to address about the point about what is literature. I learned a lot about this from doing early on in my career, because over here I worked with Professor Ballerini, and I was exposed to avant-gardism in literature early on, which taught me about boundaries and about conceptions of what is literature. One, you learn both sides. One, that's pure sign, and you can play with the sign independently of the referent. But the other side of that was that everything in literature is talking about something else. So the language, which we would say, well, it's intrinsic. How could you do, if you are a writer, you have a language and that defines you. Yes, but you can adapt, you can learn, you can become so good in another idiom that you can still create great literature, even though it's not your native. I mean, as I said before, I don't have a native language. So I write in both languages. So next time on the schema, include me in the American, in the English.
In red, in both.
Yeah. I had this problem, if you think back, going back to the canon you were mentioning before, like the canon. Every major writer that we know of wrote in several languages. Okay, D'Annunzio wrote in 4 languages. The best Neapolitan song was written by an Abruzzese, Gabriele D'Annunzio. Okay, Avuchella si chiama. Okay, the Meda Bedouin. He wrote plays in French. Le Martyrs de Saint Sébastien, that Proust went to read to learn from D'Annunzio. Okay, Foscolo, Muratori, you name it. They all wrote in more than one language, starting with Dante. One of the greatest books in Italian cultural history is Il Milione. It was written in French by a Venetian. So it's like, so this myth is something that I think that people who have not really tried writing, or have a nice, easy formula, you know? Like, I'm sure that in cinema you have the same problem, you know, this is realist cinema. That, you know, that's not cinema. Oh, that, what are you trying to do, you know? And so on and so forth. So that's my case about, and another thing about Italian culture in general, you mentioned, like, a lot of times you get the feeling that even our Italian experts in the field, sometimes they just don't go outside their own, you know, blinkered idea. There is an Italophone literature between the fall of Rome in 1527 and the birth of Italy, 1859, 1860. Cioè, the Italian intellectuals were all over Europe, France, Prague. So I went to St. Petersburg, and they took me around. They said, "Sì, quello è l'architetto italiano del 1700." I said, "Whoa!" You know, it was like St. Petersburg was designed by Italians. You know, and so there is that should be recovered in a way. Okay, that's in terms of people who wrote in Italian outside il suolo italiano, which is the nation state. I have no big myths about it. I've studied enough to know that it's just a judicial, geopolitical, administrative thing. Okay, Italians. That's why, in a way, I came around. I like the idea of the Italici. Although the word creates problems.
Yeah, but
like Rebecca West said, I spent 3/4 of my life doing Italian stuff, and you don't want to acknowledge that I have something Italian about me.
Right.
I mean, yeah, the word I circled around in your presentation that I had to mention was identity, because I wrote a book on it,
Yeah.
and it's like I'm challenging it. It's like,
Right.
the only one thing you say in your book, you say l'identità è una scelta, and that's fine. So Rebecca West chooses to be Italian because of her immersion and a total love of everything Italian. Okay, however you look at it. What my issue has been in writing over the years has been when the identity is affixed upon you as a label from the outside. And that's why I went back to studying a lot of history and about you're right when you say that Italian American did not really come around until the 70s as a word, but now we make it go back, that they were Italian Americans before they knew that they were Italian Americans. But I do address this issue in the anthology by that's brought out by
Perricone and Bonafini.
the one the introduction to Italian. I think it's called an introduction to Italian American Studies by Stan Pugliese.
Yeah, the Routledge book.
The Routledge book, which now is appearing in Italian.
Yeah.
I did a lot of work on that first generation, which I call the Italians who were no longer Italian and were not yet American. So I invented a coin, and I said the Atlantidi, the people who were like in between, because they had no language, no access to the means of reproduction, pardon my lexicon, but it's precise.
Yeah.
They had no access to public language. They didn't have the means. You're right that they came out with all the books, but that was to ghettoize themselves.
Yeah.
They were like foreigners for about one generation until their children started going here, and it really gets a little bit easier, believe it or not, after World War I, but not before. And those were the people that, to me, have to be written about, and we can only write about it if you have an idea of literature as an allegory of origins.
This is also the issue with graduate programs. Where is much of research done? At the dissertation level.
Yeah.
And those dissertations, for the most part, are turned into books, right? The good ones are turned into books. I mean, everyone who has published a couple of books, their first book is their dissertation, revamped, rewritten, whatever. And that's where it begins. Unfortunately, there's such a resistance to Italian American studies at the doctoral level that those dissertations aren't being written, unless maybe there's a history. There's a dissertation that's being worked up into a book, and I know about it only because one of the Italian American organizations I belonged to for a couple of years had what was called a Carlo Bellini dissertation fellowship, and it sort of fell off by the wayside. We're trying to revive it. Carlo Bellini, for those of you who don't know, was the first professor of Italian in the United States. He was a friend of Thomas Jefferson's, and he taught at William and Mary. So we called it the Carlo Bellini dissertation fellowship. And the first person who won it ended up in 2017, wrote a dissertation called The Privileged Dago, which is a phrase that was used in the South with regard to the Italian, with all of the Jim Crow laws, all of the discrimination that existed against Italians. And she has a chapter on miscegenation. And there's a chapter that she has which talks about how this African American was convicted for miscegenation because he had, quote unquote, had relations and married a white woman. Well, then he appealed to the state of Alabama, and it came out that the woman was Italian. Actually, she was Sicilian, and therefore he was exonerated because she wasn't white. Right? So that whole notion, and we've seen that with Jennifer Guglielmo, or Italians white, whatever. That whole notion of race and Italians in the United States doesn't come. Yeah, it's a big issue. It's a big issue. And here there's this 300 and some odd page, very well written dissertation on the experience of the Italian immigrant in the South, and the whole issue of race. So that's why it's really important to have doctoral programs that are accepting of Italian American studies, and we don't have it.
Hi, well, thank you very much. So it seems to me that you're saying that Italian American writing is kind of lost in this Bermuda Triangle. Like, from the Italian side, it sounds like it's very paternalistic, chauvinistic, like, oh, that's not Italian literature, it's Italian American. But what is keeping us here, who have had, the hyphenated literature now for 30 years, what's keeping us from recognizing Italian writing, whether it's in written in English or Italian?
That's a great question. And with regard to literature and cinema, history and sociology has a long history with regard to Italian Americans or Italians in America. The books go back to 1919. They weren't Italians who were doing it, but they go back to 1919, even earlier. There's a big book, 1919, Robert Forster. And so the historians and the sociologists have been working for a long time. But the cultural brokers have not been working for a long time. The first book on Italian American literature was published in 1974. And then the second book, authored book, was published in 1996. And then there was like a plethora of books that have come out. So now we've got about 50 or 60 of them, which is good. Most of them are good. Some of them aren't, right? Same thing with cinema. There are about 6 or 7 single-authored books on Italian American cinema. Now, there are some great articles that people have written over the years. There's a critic named Philip Kolker who wrote one of the smartest pieces on Martin Scorsese, for example, right? And there are a couple of books on Scorsese and a couple of books. But the idea of, and Coppola, whatever, some of those don't necessarily deal with the whole Italian American aspect. They deal with the thematics of the films and stuff. But to look at that film as something that represents and communicates about Italian Americans, there are only about maybe 7 or 8 books, single-authored books. And I distinguish between single-authored books as opposed to essays that of various people that are put together, only because the single author is going to try to have some sort of trajectory, right, and come up with some sort of logic that then he or she will tie up at the end. So in that sense, it's a young tradition critically, not productively, because the 1974 book is by a woman named Rose Basile Green. And in that, it's a book in which she discusses about 90 works of fiction. It's called The Italian American Novel, an interaction between two cultures, or the documentation of an interaction between two cultures. And at the end, she has a bibliography of about 212 books, all of which are published in English by very good presses. Presses like Dial Press, which exists, was a really good press, Knopf, Random House, and so on and so forth. But it's 1974. but these people have been writing for decades, right? So the first novel we've found dates back to 1835, and then there's a break
In Italian, right?
in English.
In English.
Joseph Rocchietti, who's an immigrant from Piemonte, and it's called Lorenzo e non Olaska, and it's almost like a Foscolo's Ultime Lettere di Jacoportis. There's poetry interspersed, the letters and poetry interspersed. Yeah, the next time we get Calandra, I'll show you a copy. And I got an 1845 copy. Yeah, and then there's a big gap, and then in the 1880s, and then we have the documentation from Durante, his book Italo-Americana was a really important book. The second, you know, both of them for us in literary studies. The second book was extremely important. Yeah.
Thank you both, by the way. Isn't part of the challenge that we're fighting basic human nature? We like to keep things neat and clean and delineated. You know, we like our pasta in one spot, and we like our veal over here. We don't want to look at a pastiche, as my grandmother used to say. And part of the problem is you've got, there may be much more truth to the concept that there are authors stretching all around the globe with similar threads, common threads,
Yeah.
but they carry all sorts of ethnic and social backgrounds that they bring to the table, and nobody wants to see that because it's much more complicated, it's harder to understand, and you get all sorts of branching off into all different places, and who wants to figure all that out?
I think there's something else too, and jump in. But I think there's the history of Italians in America. In Robert Viscusi, who laid the groundwork for us, basically, as a thinker, I think, for those of us who've written after, culturally. Robert Viscusi would say we lost our language. And we did. The contested history of Italians in America, the horrible discrimination, nowhere near, of course, what Africans experience, African Americans experience. So we need to, recognize that up front. But it is true that Italians have the dubious distinction of being the largest group lynched in a single lynching, right? 11 in New Orleans. The discrimination against Italians as swarthy and violent and dirty and whatever, and backstabbers and womanizers, whatever. That leads then up to World War II, when Italy then becomes, part of the Axis, when we really lost our language at that point. Don't speak the enemy's language, which you saw in the post offices and stuff. I think that somewhere is in there, and post-World War II is the collective is fighting against that. And so we really need to engage in a rediscovery of language and a rediscovery of identity. There's a really nice documentary called Little Italy by Will Parignello from he did in '95. It's sort of Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area set, and he's got this 90-something-year-old guy who has a very thick Italian accent, and this guy professes to be more American than Americans, right? And that's great. That's what I mean by choice. And that's great. And I'm sure that if someone said to him, "You're an Italian American," he'd blow a gasket, and that's fine. But unfortunately, I think that all that negative history has really made it a challenge for us. So some of the defenders of certain things today aren't as informed as perhaps they could be when it comes to defending certain symbols. And that's I think that World War II and that whole, I still have my grandmother's enemy alien card. It was a passport. It's literally a little booklet, just like our passports, with blank pages where they were supposed to stamp when you left town, when you went to ask for permission. So
Let me add a few words to that. One of the issues that I think maybe was implied in my remarks about Anthony's research and work and my own position is the concept of class.
Of what?
Class.
Oh.
I mean, like again, I circled around it with that. For instance, on the first part of your question, I would not go as far as to say it's human nature, because I've been rereading some of the classics from Aristotle on, and I'm afraid to use such a sweeping thing, but it is something that can be constructed, induced by fast-acting advertising media, the yes-no, the us versus them, and that carries into saying, well, like you were saying before, if you eat the salad before, you're American. If you eat it after, you're okay. Now these have value in terms of assembling the signs and then to decode something. Okay, but semiotics is the front step before you go into something which is like all of a sudden beleaguered. For instance, what if 2 or 3 of the greatest American critics, especially in cinema, are Italian? Frank Capra, and was an Italian immigrant that was 5, 6 years old when he came. He became a filmmaker. He's the one who actually launched the idea of the American dream through cinema. The idea of the American dream is not something that existed in the 19th century. Okay, it was created after World War I, actually. I did a research on that. I had my students do a research on that. And then through cinema was, but what recent people that you know them, what's his name, who wrote a book on it, what people don't understand is the dark side of America that comes under the American dream, the individualism, this and that, and so on and so forth. I mentioned before, like when it comes to Italy, it was like again a foreigner who actually gave us like a linguistic history of Italy, and so on and so forth. But another topic which is not mentioned in this work of yours, but it was mentioned in previous works, and we both dealt with this, is that some of the resistance, I think maybe also addressing the lady's question before, has come from our own kind, okay? On both sides of the Atlantic, okay? In Italy, for instance, dialect literature, as we all know, right, was considered taboo until the 50s, until Pasolini, breakthrough on everything, kind of says, what do you mean? We have a whole literature here. And it's Italo-Americana by Vittorini was another way of introducing, for instance, American literature, which before that was like, not good. In the United States, some of the great resistance to an Italian-American literature and to an Italian-American cinema, if I may, although I'm not too documented on that, has come from Italian-Americans themselves. Okay, and Anthony has been battling for years, saying, and every opportunity he gets, when you happen to mention before about philanthropy and the zerilli-marimò, yeah, because why don't Italian Americans who are very wealthy, rich, who have made it, who are third generation, what's their idea? Are they comfortable with the stereotype of, in the 21st century of like spaghetti meatballs when they even disappeared from the Bronx? I took a tour recently in my old hunting grounds. Nobody cooks that anymore. But they still think in those terms. Why is it that they do not come out in favor? And it's no longer a question of culture. The earlier generation were not educated. There were people who made big business with only a high school education, like Generoso Pope and others. Fine. But not everyone seems to have had a college education of sorts, so we cannot attribute it to that. Why is it that they do not come out? And one of the things my first attempt at addressing that was in Naples, if you remember last year, when I said, we need a critical discourse about the fact that Italian Americans is not some homogeneous body of hyphenated literature. We need to know that there's people on the right, on the left, that there is avant-gardists, and that there's some retrograde people who are very fine. And by the way, I'm not a fan of Scorsese, okay? I actually hate him, but that's my opinion.
Be recorded, Peter.
Oh, scratch that.
philanthropy is very, very much lacking in everyone talk to bounce off of Peter's before I can bounce off of Peter's different Italian Americans. We speak in terms of an Italian American community. There's an Italian American population with a plethora of different voices, right? Which is great. It's wonderful. Now we have to learn how to engage in dialogue and debate, as I said a few years ago, because people were engaging instead in denigration and dismissal. So we have to understand that we're not going to agree, and I just wrote something, so it's in my head. We're not going to agree on Columbus, right? But we're going to agree on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, right? And that's fine. And we're not going to agree on something, but there's going to be yet another thing we're going to agree on. So we won't sit at the same Columbus table, but we'll sit at the same Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And that doesn't exist in this thing that some of the self-proclaimed call the Italian American community.
And the media
We have to realize that there are different voices. And the other thing is, and this is my own reading, is that maybe we need another generation, I don't know, and which means though we need another generation, that generation has to be educated, has to learn about Italy, Italian Americans, et cetera, learn the language, et cetera. Maybe we have to wait another generation before the well-heeled feel that they can give also to the non-concrete. A distinguished professorship in Italian American studies is not a concrete thing. This is a concrete thing, sure, but a distinguished professorship is not a concrete thing. So that's the issue. You know, we make some of us joke when we say Italians give the hospitals and churches. They have the hospitals, they have the hospital to save them. And if the hospital doesn't, they give the churches because hopefully their soul will be saved, right? If they're believers. So you know, they've got to become convinced now that there's that third issue, and that third issue being education and culture. Yeah.
I think it's all the time we have for tonight. And before we close, I just want to mention very briefly that we have been going into this topic on different fronts. And of course, tonight we had the best discussion we could have about literature in its intricacies and complexities. But not too long ago, 3-4 weeks ago, we had a panel discussion here on Lucio Fontana, one of the most important contemporary Italian artists that has an exhibit right now at the Met Breuer. And we talked about his Argentinian identity. He was born of Italian immigrant parents in Rosario, in Argentina, and he went back to Italy as a young boy, and then he returned to Argentina. And we were saying that in his catalogue Raisonné, that fact is completely ignored by the Italian art historian that is considered the authority on Fontana. And, you know, there is another son of immigrants, Argentinian, who happens to be Italian, who sits on the seat of Peter in Rome right now. But I want to close this evening with a quote from another immigrant who was on this stage not too long ago. He came for a presentation of a book by Gianna Pontecorboli called A Me Ricordo, and it's a collection of interviews with Jewish refugees that came to this country from Italy because of the racial laws and the persecution of Jews in Italy. And Guido Calabresi, who for 10 years was the dean of the law school at Yale, and he was the professor of at least 4 Supreme Court justices. President Clinton appointed him at the United States District Court. One of the most brilliant legal minds of this country. He should have been on the Supreme Court if they asked me, but they didn't. And when he was on this stage, he said something that I think applies to all of you who do literature, all of us who do literature, but also art. And he said, I am the judge that I am, and I'm the scholar that I am because I'm an immigrant and I'm a refugee. And he didn't say I was. He said, I am. I'm the scholar that I am, and I'm the judge that I am because I'm an immigrant and a refugee. And I think we should claim with the same pride of Judge Calabresi that immigrant identity, because it's something that adds to the discourse, and it doesn't subtract. And so this is my conclusion. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thanks to all of you.